The clink of his fork against the porcelain plate was the only sound in the penthouse, a sharp, metallic punctuation to the relentless drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city of Seoul sprawled below them, a glittering, rain-slicked tapestry of light and shadow, but it felt a million miles away. In here, the air was cold, curated, and silent. I sat opposite him, the crimson silk of my dress a splash of defiant color in the monochromatic dining room. The fabric was a cage, elegant and binding, just like the room, just like the man I called my husband.
Kwon Yi-hon.
His name was a whisper of power on the lips of the city's elite, and a curse on the tongues of his enemies. To me, it was the sound of the lock clicking shut.
He wasn't looking at me.
His attention was fixed on the phone pressed to his ear, his handsome face cast in the cool, blue light of the screen. His suit was Tom Ford, black and severe, tailored to perfection over a body built for lethal efficiency. I knew the way the muscles in his back shifted when he moved, the cold weight of his presence when he entered a room. I knew the scent of his cologne, cedarwood and something else, something like smoke and winter air. I knew all the superficial details of the man who owned my life, but I did not know him at all. He was speaking in Korean, his voice a low, confidential murmur that carried an undercurrent of steel. I wasn't supposed to understand. I was the foreign bride, the American girl he'd acquired in a transaction so complex and blood-soaked I still didn't know all the details. I was a beautiful, compliant ornament. That was my role. But I'd spent the last 6 months of our marriage in this gilded cage with nothing but time. So I learned. I listened to the guards, to the house staff, to his hushed phone calls. I picked up the language the way a survivor learns to find fresh water.
Piece by piece.
Word by word. Tonight, the words were sharp. I caught them like fragments of glass. Rival family.
Choi.
An arrangement. A new alliance. And then, the phrase that made the chilled wine in my glass seemed to turn to ice. A wife is just a wife. My posture remained perfect. My hands stayed folded in my lap. I had learned stillness from him. I had learned to mask everything behind a placid facade. He glanced at me then, a flicker of his dark, obsidian eyes. He must have seen something in my expression, some flicker of comprehension I failed to suppress. A cruel, knowing smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He turned his attention back to the phone, and for the benefit of whoever was on the other end, he switched to perfect, unaccented English. Of course, the transition will be seamless, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes still on me, holding me captive. A marriage contract is a small matter. Easily dissolved, easily replaced, he paused, letting the silence stretch, a predator playing with its food. Then he laughed. It was not a sound of mirth. It was a cold, empty thing, the sound of a vault door closing. I can always marry again. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, stripping away the last fragile layer of the illusion I'd built for myself. The illusion that this was survivable, that my compliance could buy me a sort of peace. His words were not just a dismissal, they were an erasure. He was telling me, and the world, that I was nothing, a placeholder, temporary. Something inside me, something I thought had long been extinguished, snapped. Slowly, I placed my napkin on the table. The movement was deliberate, quiet. I pushed my chair back, the legs whispering against the polished marble floor. Ji-hoon's gaze sharpened, a hint of annoyance in his eyes. He made a small, impatient gesture with his free hand, a silent command to sit down, to not interrupt him. I ignored it. I stood, the red silk of my dress pooling around my feet like blood. I turned my back on him and walked out of the dining room. Each step was a lifetime. I walked past the collection of priceless ceramics he never looked at, past the abstract art that was more about investment than beauty. My footsteps were soundless on the thick wool rugs of the hallway. I entered our bedroom. His side was immaculate, severe. My side was a small island of rebellion, a stack of novels in English, a photograph of my family I kept hidden in a drawer, a single wilting rose in a bud vase. The room was dark, the only light coming from the city glow filtering through the rain-streaked windows. My hand felt heavy. I looked down at the wedding ring he had placed there 6 months ago. a flawless, square-cut diamond on a platinum band. It was cold, heavy, a beautiful manacle. It was a symbol of his ownership, a claim. With a steadiness that surprised me, I slid the ring off my finger. The absence of its weight was a shock, a sudden, dizzying lightness. My hand felt alien without it, naked.
Free.
I closed my fingers around the ring, the sharp edges of the diamond digging into my palm. I walked back down the hallway, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I stopped just at the edge of the dining room, concealed by the shadows of the archway. Ji-hoon was finishing his call, his back partially to me. "It is done," he said in Korean. "Prepare the contracts." He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table with a soft click. He sat there for a moment, staring out at the rain, the absolute master of his universe. Finally, he turned, expecting to see me still sitting there, waiting for him. His eyes scanned the empty chair, and a frown creased his brow. "Zara," he called out, his voice laced with an irritation that was quickly turning to anger. He pushed himself to his feet. That's when he saw it. On the dark, polished floor, exactly where I had been standing when I turned my back on him, lay my wedding ring. It caught the dim light from the chandelier, glittering like a fallen star, or a single, defiant hair. I watched his face. The casual cruelty, the bored indifference, it all vanished. His expression hardened, shifting into something I had only seen him direct at his enemies. It was sharp. It was cold. It was dangerous. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He took a step forward and bent down, his movements fluid and precise. He picked up the ring. He held it in his palm, staring at it as if it were a bomb. That was the moment everything changed. I had not just defied him. I had rejected his claim. In his world, there was no greater insult. I slipped back into the shadows and ran.
He found me in the library.
It was my only sanctuary in the penthouse, a 2-story room lined with leather-bound books I doubted he had ever opened. I wasn't reading. I was standing by the window, watching the storm, my arms wrapped around myself. I was not crying. The time for tears was long past. All I felt was a terrifying, crystalline clarity. The doors opened behind me. I didn't have to turn to know it was him. His presence was a physical force, sucking the warmth from the air. "You will put this back on," he said.
It was not a request.
I turned slowly to face him. He stood in the center of the room, the ring held between his thumb and forefinger. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. His eyes narrowed. "This is not a game, Zara." "You're right," I said, taking a step toward him. "It stopped being a game when you offered me up to the Choi family, like a sacrificial lamb. It stopped being a game when you laughed about replacing me." He went utterly still. The flicker of surprise in his eyes was almost imperceptible, but I saw it. He had not known I could understand him. He had underestimated me. In his world, underestimation was a fatal mistake. "You do not understand my world," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You do not understand the politics." That call was a necessary maneuver. "I understand that you called me disposable," I shot back. "And I will not be disposable." In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between us. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His grip was like steel. "You think you can just walk away? You are my wife. You are mine. You belong to me until I say otherwise." The heat of his anger radiated off him, but all I felt was cold. I met his furious gaze, without flinching. "You wanted an ornament, Ji-hoon. A pretty doll to sit at your table. But dolls don't have opinions. And they don't listen to your phone calls. You made a mistake." His grip tightened, his knuckles white. For a moment, I saw a flash of raw violence in his eyes, and I knew he was capable of breaking me. But then, something shifted. The fury receded, replaced by that familiar, chilling calculation. He let go of my arm as if my skin had burned him. He turned away, running a hand through his perfectly styled black hair. "Sentiment," he said, his back to me. "It is a weapon, the most effective one your enemies have. They look for it, for any crack in your armor, any attachment, any weakness." He turned back to face me, and his eyes were haunted. "Before you, there was another woman, Minesio." It was an arranged marriage like this one. But I was younger. More foolish. He stared at a point over my shoulder, seeing a ghost. I let myself care for her. Our rivals, the Park family, saw it. They saw the way I looked at her. They saw my weakness. So they took her. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain. They took her to send me a message, he continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, to prove I was not fit to lead my family, that I was too soft. They sent her back to me a week later, in pieces. A lesson I only needed to learn once. He looked at me, his eyes boring into mine. So yes, Zara, you are disposable. Everyone in my life is disposable. I have to be able to cut them loose, to sacrifice them, or my enemies will do it for me. That is the only way to survive. The only way to win. It was not an apology. It was a justification. A glimpse into the abyss of the man he was, the world that had forged him. He was showing me his wound, the one piece of vulnerability he carried, not to earn my sympathy, but to warn me, to show me the cold, hard logic of his universe. Before I could process the horror of his story, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor sharpened. "What is it?" he snapped into the phone. He listened, his body tensing.
Where?
"How many?" He cursed under his breath in Korean. "The Choi clan. They're here. They're in the building." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than anger or calculation in his eyes. It was a flicker of something raw, something akin to alarm. "They think you are the key," he said, his voice grim. "They think by taking you, they can force my hand on the port deal." His feint on the phone call had backfired. Instead of drawing out a traitor, it had been seen as an invitation, a sign that he held me in no regard and that I was an easy target. His head of security, a grim-faced man named Mr. Park, burst into the room. "Boss, we have to move. They've compromised the lobby elevators." Ji-hoon nodded. "All business now. Service corridors. To the sub-level garage."
Go.
He grabbed my arm again, but this time it wasn't with anger. It was with a possessive urgency. He pulled me along behind him, his body a shield. We moved through the hidden passages of the penthouse, a world of concrete and steel behind the polished marble. Alarms began to blare, a shrill, piercing sound that vibrated through the walls. In the narrow, dimly lit service corridor, chaos erupted. Two of Ji-hoon's men were ahead of us, two behind. Suddenly, one of the men in front, a man I'd seen 100 times, spun around. His face was pale with sweat. He had a gun in his hand, and it was pointed not at Ji-hoon, but at Mr. Park. A traitor. Everything happened in a blur of motion. Ji-hoon shoved me behind him, drawing his own weapon with impossible speed. But the traitor was close, too close to Mr. Park. A shot was too risky. In that split second of hesitation, I saw it. A heavy steel pipe, left behind by a maintenance crew, was leaning against the wall. I didn't think. I acted. While all eyes were on the gun, I lunged for the pipe. It was heavy, unwieldy. I had been a competitive fencer in college a lifetime ago. The muscle memory of balance, of leverage, of a weapon in my hand, was still there. I swung the pipe in a low, hard arc, slamming it into the back of the traitor's knees. He cried out, his legs buckling. The gun fired, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet ricocheting off the concrete ceiling. As he fell, Mr. Park moved, disarming him with brutal efficiency. It was over in seconds. The corridor was filled with the smell of cordite and the sound of the traitor's pained gasps. Ji-hoon stared at me. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were wide with a kind of stunned disbelief. In the midst of the chaos, with alarms blaring and the threat of an army of assassins descending on us, I could have run. I could have tried to disappear. Instead, I had chosen to stay, to fight. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed my hand, his grip firm, and pulled me forward. "Come on." We made it to the armored car in the sub-level garage. The doors slammed shut, encasing us in a bubble of silence and safety as the vehicle sped out into the rainy Seoul night. The adrenaline was a wild, humming thing in my veins. My hands were shaking. I looked down and saw a smear of dirt on the sleeve of my ruined silk dress. Ji-hoon was sitting across from me, his gun resting on his lap. He was just looking at me, his gaze intense and unnervingly focused. There was a small cut on my cheek from a piece of flying debris. I hadn't even felt it. Before I could react, he leaned forward. He reached out, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he tilted my chin up. His thumb brushed against my cheek, wiping away a single drop of blood. His touch was electric, a stark contrast to the violence of the last few minutes. It was the first time he had ever touched me with anything resembling care. Our eyes met, and the space between us crackled with a new, unspoken tension. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, painting fleeting patterns across his face. "You're full of surprises, Zara," he said, his voice low and rough. The mockery was gone, replaced by something else. Something I couldn't yet name. The safe house was a minimalist apartment in a sleek, anonymous tower overlooking the Han River. It was all glass and steel and black leather, as cold and impersonal as Ji-hoon himself. The danger wasn't over. It was just contained for now. He stood by the vast window, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes. I was on the sofa, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the ruined red dress discarded in a heap. "The phone call was a lie," he said, without turning around.
A test.
I suspected a leak in my organization to the Choi clan. I fed them information I knew they would act on, a fake proposal of a new marriage alliance. I needed to see who would move, who would betray me. I stared at his reflection in the glass. "You used me as bait. I used a situation," he corrected, finally turning to face me. "I never expected them to move on you directly, or for you to understand the conversation. Both were miscalculations on my part." He walked over and sat in the armchair opposite me. He looked tired. It was the first time I had ever seen even a hint of weariness in him. "They saw you as leverage, an easy pressure point." They were wrong. His eyes flickered to my hands, as if he could still see me holding that pipe. Just then, his phone, sitting on the glass coffee table, lit up with a new message. He picked it up. As he read it, every trace of weariness vanished, replaced by an arctic coldness that was more terrifying than his anger. Without a word, he turned the screen toward me. It was a photograph. A simple, two-story house with a small, neat lawn. My family's home in Chicago. Below it, a line of text. "We know your weakness. The port territory, or we take her from you. Not like last time. This time we'll make you watch." The blood drained from my face. This was no longer about business or territory. They had reached across the world and put a target on the only people I had left. They were going to punish him by destroying me, and they were going to start with my family. Ji-hoon's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He saw the terror in my eyes. "They will not touch them," he said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "I will burn their entire organization to the ground first." But the choice were not to be underestimated. They tracked us. The attack on the safe house was sudden and brutal. The sound of splintering wood as the door was kicked in was the only warning we had. Ji-hoon moved with a deadly grace, a phantom of violence. He took down 2 men before I could even fully register what was happening. But there were more. Mr. Park and the other guards were holding them at bay in the hallway, the sound of gunfire echoing through the apartment. One of them broke through. He was huge, his face a mask of brutal determination. He ignored Ji-hoon, his eyes locking on me. He saw his prize. He lunged for me. I scrambled back, but he was too fast. He grabbed me, his arm wrapping around my throat, and pressed the cold, flat blade of a knife against my skin. "Drop it, Kwon," he snarled, "or she dies right here." Across the room, Ji-hoon froze. He had a clear shot, his gun steady in his hand. But the man was using me as a perfect shield. For one agonizing second, Ji-hoon's mask of absolute control shattered. I saw it in his eyes, a flash of pure, undiluted fury mixed with something that looked terrifyingly like fear. The ghost of Min Seo was in the room with us. He was seeing it happen all over again. I was not going to be his ghost. I was not going to be his lesson. I stopped struggling. I let my body go limp for a fraction of a second, a dead weight against my captor's arm. He grunted, adjusting his grip. In that moment of adjustment, I drove the heel of my shoe down onto his instep with all my force. He roared in pain, his hold loosening for a bare instant.
It was all I needed.
I slammed the back of my head into his face. I felt the crunch of cartilage, and he screamed, a wet, gurgling sound. The knife scraped against my neck, drawing a line of fire, but his grip was broken. He stumbled back, and in that same instant, the sound of Ji-hoon's pistol cracked through the air. A single, precise shot. The man dropped to the floor, a neat hole in his forehead. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hand flying to my neck. It came away, wet with blood. The apartment fell silent, the fighting outside over. I looked from the dead man at my feet to Ji-hoon. The space between my old life and this one had collapsed. I had not just been a victim. I had fought back. I had crossed a line, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I could never go back. Later, after his men had cleaned up the mess and secured the building, I stood in the bathroom, dabbing at the cut on my neck with an antiseptic wipe. It wasn't deep, but it stung. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and blood on her collar. I saw him in the reflection before I heard him. He was standing in the doorway, just watching me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He walked into the bathroom, his presence filling the small space. He stopped behind me. I told myself this marriage was a business arrangement, he said, his voice quiet and rough. A way to control a liability. A name on a piece of paper, he paused. It was a lie. I met his eyes in the mirror. My own were wide, questioning. What is it now? I whispered. He looked at the raw, red line on my neck. His gaze was dark, intense. It is my primary vulnerability, he admitted. The words sounded like they were torn from him, a confession ripped from the most fortified part of his soul. In his world, that was more intimate than any declaration of love. It was an admission of a fatal flaw. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. The next day, he laid out his plan. A final, decisive strike against the Choi clan. He would use their threat against my family to lure their leader, Choi Min-ho, into a trap. A meeting, he called it. A slaughter, I knew. And he planned to go himself, with only a small team. It was a suicide mission, born of rage, and a need to prove he could protect what was his. I found him in the study, staring at a map of the city's docklands. You're going to get yourself killed, I said, my voice sharp. He didn't look up. This is my concern, not yours. They threaten my family. That makes it my concern, I retorted. You're walking into this blind with rage. You're thinking about revenge for Min Seo, not strategy. And you're going to fail. He finally looked at me, his eyes blazing. And what would you know about strategy? I know that for 6 months, my only job was to be invisible. So I watched and I listened. I know you suspect the port manager is the one who has been feeding Choi information. I know the shipping routes because I translated the manifests for you 3 months ago when your regular girl was sick. You think he'll meet you at the docks, your territory?
No, he's not that stupid.
He'll want neutral ground. Somewhere public, but with an easy escape route. I took a deep breath. Your plan is flawed. Mine is better. I laid it out for him. We would propose a parley at the National Museum. Public, crowded, cameras everywhere. But we would use their own arrogance against them. I would make the call. My voice, my American accent, would sound like fear. Like a terrified wife begging for her family's safety. I would be the bait. But I would also be the architect of the trap. He listened, his expression unreadable. When I was finished, the silence was absolute. He studied me for a long time, as if seeing me for the first time. They will not be expecting you to be a part of it, he said, a slow, dawning realization in his voice. They see you as the prize, the weakness. And that, I said, meeting his gaze, is how we will win. The main hall of the museum was a cavern of marble and echoing footsteps. I stood near a display of ancient Silla dynasty pottery, a tiny communications device tucked into my ear. Ji-hoon and his men were ghosts, melted into the crowds, watching from the balconies. I was the focal point, the target. Choi Min-ho arrived with a small entourage, his eyes scanning the hall until they landed on me. He was older than Ji-hoon, with a cruel smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He approached me, exuding a smug confidence. Mrs. Kwan, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. So brave of you to come. My family, I said, letting a tremor enter my voice. Leave them alone. That depends entirely on your husband, he sneered, moving closer. Where is the coward? That was the signal. He's right behind you, I said, my voice suddenly clear and cold. As Choi's head whipped around, I triggered the device in my hand. Not an explosion.
A sound.
A high-frequency pulse that shattered the glass display cases throughout the hall. The sudden, violent noise and showering glass created chaos. People screamed and ran. In that moment of disorientation, Ji-hoon's men moved. It was a swift, silent, surgical strike. They descended on Choi's men, neutralizing them before they could even draw their weapons. Ji-hoon himself appeared as if from thin air, his hand clamped on Choi Min-ho's shoulder. The fight was over before it had truly begun. My plan had worked. I hadn't been rescued. I had been a part of the victory. Afterward, back in the penthouse, the silence was different. It wasn't cold or empty. It was full. Full of everything that had happened. Everything that had changed between us. The war was over. The Choi clan was broken. My family was safe. I stood by the window, watching the first light of dawn paint the sky over the city. I had not run. I was still here. He came to stand behind me. I felt his presence, the warmth of his body. He took my hand, and I felt the cool, familiar metal of the wedding ring press against my skin. He tried to slide it onto my finger. I gently stopped him, my fingers closing over his. Is this still a cage, Ji-hoon? I asked, my voice quiet. He turned me to face him. His dark eyes searched my face, lingering on the now fading scratch on my neck. The mask was gone. All I saw was the man beneath. No, he said, his voice raw with an emotion I had never heard from him before. It is an anchor. And you are the center of my empire. Without you, it all falls. He opened his hand and placed the ring in my palm. It felt heavy, real. It is your choice, he said. It always should have been. A cost had been paid. Mr. Park had been injured in the final takedown, a permanent limp the price of loyalty. The innocence I once had was a distant memory, a country I could never visit again. And Ji-hoon, he had exposed his heart, a strategic risk from which he might never recover. I looked down at the ring glittering in my hand. It was just a piece of metal, a symbol. It had been a prison. It had been a weapon. Now it was a choice. I closed my fingers around it, the metal cool and solid against my skin. I didn't put it on.
Not yet.
I looked up at him, at the most dangerous man in Seoul, the man who had once been prepared to discard me. And in his dark, unreadable eyes, I saw the one thing he could no longer hide: fear. The absolute, profound fear of me saying no. For the first time since I had entered his world, I held all the power. And outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean and waiting for a new day.